$108 million, 300 kilometers of jammed sky, and on the night of June 14, 2026, it took one Ukrainian drone 11 seconds to turn all of it into scrap metal. The machine was called Krasukha 4, parked at Hvardiiske airbase, 12 kilometers northeast of Simferopol. It was Russia's answer to a problem it never solved honestly. How do you defend a peninsula you cannot fully garrison? The answer, on paper, was electronic. Jam the GPS, blind the radar seekers, scramble the satellite links before a drone ever gets close enough to matter. For 9 months, that answer worked. Russian officers briefed it as fact. Crimea's skies, they said, were digitally sealed. Then a single Lyutyi drone flew a corridor the jammer itself had carved out. Not a gap in Russian defenses, a gap made by the defense. This is the story of that corridor, how it was found, who found it, and what happened in the 72 hours after Hvardiiske's rotating antenna hit the ground. Stick with this one. The part about how a jammer blinds itself is stranger than anything in the official reports. And by the end, you'll understand why Russian commanders spent 3 days lying about a fire that was never a fire. Start with what Krasukha 4 actually is, because most coverage of this war treats electronic warfare like background noise. It isn't. It's the reason some Ukrainian strikes succeed, and others never make it off the launch rail. The 1RL-257 Krasukha 4 is a mobile jamming complex, built on a pair of 8-wheeled chassis with a rotating dish antenna the size of a small satellite receiver bolted to a hydraulic mast. One vehicle carries the jamming electronics. The other carries the crew, the generators, and the cooling systems needed to keep the whole thing from cooking itself in a Crimean summer. Its job is narrow but brutal in effect. It floods the electromagnetic spectrum around it with noise, targeted specifically at the GPS frequencies drones and precision munitions rely on to navigate. It also degrades airborne and satellite radar, making it harder for reconnaissance platforms to build a clean picture of what's moving underneath its coverage envelope. Russian sources have priced a single Krasukha 4 unit at somewhere north of $100 million, depending on which variant and which contract year you're reading. Analysts inside Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, the HER, settled on a working estimate of $108 million for the Hvardiiske unit specifically, factoring in the newer signal processing suite it was known to carry. One machine, $108 million, covering an arc of roughly 300 kilometers across western and central Crimea. Complexes like this don't run themselves. A standard Krasukha 4 crew numbers somewhere between 14 and 16 personnel, split across 2 rotating shifts to keep the antenna manned around the clock, because a jammer that sleeps is a jammer that might as well not exist. The unit at Hvardiiske fell under the operational umbrella of a regional electronic warfare brigade, one of several Russia has folded into its southern military district since 2022, each tasked with stitching together overlapping coverage across occupied territory. On paper, overlapping coverage sounds like redundancy. In practice, it meant that when one node went dark, its neighbors were expected to compensate instantly, assumption nobody had seriously tested against a single, precisely aimed strike. That's not one jammer among many. That's the spine. Spare parts told their own story. A Krasukha 4's signal processing module, the component most prone to failure under constant Crimean heat, could only be sourced from 2 manufacturing lines inside Russia, both already stretched thin, supplying newer units to the front in Zaporizhia and Kherson. Maintenance logs recovered in fragments show the Hvardiiske unit had reported at least 2 partial processing outages in the 6 months before the strike, each patched with cannibalized components pulled from a damaged sister unit rather than factory-fresh replacements. That detail matters less for what it says about Russian industrial capacity than for what it says about the crew's daily reality. They were operating a flagship system with a supply chain held together by improvisation, and every one of those improvised fixes was a small, unlogged deviation from the antenna's original calibration. The unit arrived at Hvardiiske in September 2025, redeployed from a training ground outside Krasnodar after 2 earlier Crimean EW sites had already been damaged by Ukrainian strikes further east. One a jamming post near Feodosia hit in July, the other a radar-linked suppression node outside Yevpatoria struck in August. Whoever made that redeployment decision was trying to consolidate. Fewer targets, thicker coverage, harder for Ukraine to plan around. The convoy that moved the Hvardiiske unit into position traveled at night, in 3 separate serials spaced hours apart, standard practice for high-value EW assets, since the string of summer losses had made daylight movement across the peninsula feel like an invitation. For a while, it worked exactly as designed. Ukrainian long-range drone units noticed the change almost immediately. A Bober, or a Lyutyi drone that would normally hold a GPS-guided course within a few meters of accuracy, started drifting, sometimes 10 meters off track, sometimes 40, enough to miss a hangar, enough to clip the wrong end of a runway, enough, in 3 documented cases between October and December 2025, for a drone to lose its lock entirely and fly itself into the Black Sea. Ukrainian planners started calling the affected airspace the Dead Arc, not a nickname meant for morale, a working term, because for 3 months, strikes launched into that 300-kilometer radius simply failed at a higher rate than strikes anywhere else on the peninsula. Internal after-action reports from that period, later folded into the planning documents this story draws from, describe a rising sense inside Ukrainian strike cells that Hvardiiske had effectively become a no-go radius, a hole in the map that swallowed hardware without giving anything back in return. Morale among operator crews, several of whom had flown successful missions elsewhere on the peninsula, took a specific kind of hit that's rarely discussed in public reporting. The frustration of watching a drone perform exactly as trained, right up until the moment it simply stopped listening to its own navigation system. Here's what's strange, though, and it's the detail that eventually mattered more than anything else in this story. Jamming isn't magic, it's physics, and physics has edges. A directional jammer like Krasukha 4 doesn't blanket the sky evenly in every direction. Its main beam, the concentrated core of its jamming power, points wherever the antenna is aimed. Everywhere else, the signal is weaker, and at low altitude, close to the ground, terrain and the jammer's own emissions create pockets where the interference is inconsistent, sometimes almost absent. Nobody inside her knew that gap existed with certainty in late 2025. They suspected it. Every jamming system has a blind seam somewhere. Finding it on a moving, rotating, actively defended target is a different problem entirely. That's the mystery this story is really about. Not whether Ukraine could hit Hvardiiske, whether they could find the 11 seconds of exposure a $108 million jammer left for itself every single time it powered up. Assign this problem to a team, and you get a specific kind of officer. The HERE planning cell responsible for Krasukha 4 operated under the internal name Argus, after the many-eyed watchman of Greek myth. Fitting, because for months, that's all they did. Watch. The cell's lead planner went by the call sign Falcon in internal communications. His actual identity remains protected, standard practice for personnel involved in strikes this sensitive. What's documented, through the declassified strike planning fragments this story draws from, is his method. Falcon's team didn't try to guess the gap from theory. They tried to provoke it, over and over, using cheap disposable reconnaissance drones as bait. Send a small quadcopter toward the Hvardiiske perimeter. Watch its telemetry degrade. Log exactly where, at what altitude, at what bearing from the antenna, the signal loss became total versus merely partial. Most of those bait drones never came home. That was the point. Losing a $2,000 reconnaissance drone to map 3 seconds of exposure was a trade Falcon's team was happy to make, over and over, for months. The methodology, reconstructed from mission logs, was closer to fisheries surveying than anything most people picture when they hear drone warfare. Each bait flight followed a slightly different approach vector, logged in a running spreadsheet that grew to hold more than 200 individual data points by the time the mapping phase ended. Altitude in 10-meter increments. Bearing in 5-degree increments. Time of day, because the antenna's rotation habits shifted, depending on whether Russian crews were responding to daytime reconnaissance flights or the quieter nighttime patterns Ukraine preferred for anything that mattered. One bait flight in November 2025 came within 4 kilometers of the base before losing lock entirely, close enough that Falcon's team initially wondered whether they'd stumbled onto the corridor on the very first serious attempt. They hadn't. Follow-up flights along the identical bearing failed within the first 6 kilometers, a discrepancy that took another 3 weeks to explain. The antenna had simply been pointed somewhere else that particular night, a coincidence dressed up as a discovery. That failure taught the team something more valuable than a successful flight would have. The gap wasn't a fixed hole in the sky. It was a habit, and habits had to be mapped across dozens of nights before a pattern could be trusted. By February 2026, they had a pattern. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a fixed corridor on a map that would hold every night. It depended on which direction the antenna was aimed, which depended on which direction Ukrainian reconnaissance assets were approaching from that particular week, which depended on Russian rotation schedules Ukraine could only partially observe. In plain terms, the jammer's blind spot moved because the jammer itself decided where to point its strongest jamming. Every time it locked onto a threat axis, it thinned its coverage somewhere else. I spent time going through the reconstructed telemetry logs for this story, and one detail kept nagging at me. The blind seam consistently opened lowest and widest along a north-northwest bearing, hugging the terrain toward the Sivash lagoon. That's not the direction most Ukrainian strikes on Crimea historically approached from. Everyone expected drones to come from due north, across the isthmus, the shortest geographic line. The jammer's operators had apparently expected that too, and pointed their strongest suppression exactly there, which meant the safest way in was also the slowest, the longest, and the least intuitive. That's not a coincidence anyone planned. That's a jammer optimizing for the threat it expected and leaving the threat it didn't expect almost untouched. Before this story moves to the strike itself, it's worth pausing on the men whose habits Falcon's team was actually mapping, because a jamming system is only as predictable as the people running it, and the people running Krasukha 4 that winter were, by most accounts pieced together from intercepted chatter, unremarkable in exactly the way that makes them easy to model. Shift logs recovered in fragments describe a rotating crew of roughly a dozen technicians and 2 senior operators per watch, most in their mid-20s to early 30s, several with prior postings at fixed radar sites in Russia's southern military district, before being folded into the mobile EW brigade structure. Boredom, more than vigilance, appears to have been the dominant condition of the job. Long stretches with nothing on the scope but civilian air traffic and the occasional reconnaissance blip, punctuated by short bursts of real activity whenever Ukrainian drone launches further north triggered a base-wide alert. One name surfaces more than once in the intercepted communications from that period: a senior lieutenant, referred to in radio traffic by a call sign that translates roughly to Osnova, who appears to have run the overnight watch at Hvardiiske for much of the winter. Osnova's habits, unknowingly, became some of the most valuable data Falcon's team collected. He favored pointing the antenna toward the isthmus during the first hours of any alert, a habit consistent enough across multiple nights that Argus analysts eventually flagged it by name in their own internal notes, not as a criticism, but as a predictable input to build a model around. There's something quietly unsettling about that. A man doing his job competently, by the standards of his own training, becoming the single most exploitable variable in the system he was trusted to run. Knowing a corridor exists is not the same as flying through it successfully. Between February and June 2026, Falcon's team ran the numbers on exactly one live fire option: a single Lyutyi drone, flown low along the lagoon shoreline, timed to a specific window when Hvardiiske's antenna would most likely be locked onto a different, expected threat axis. One drone. Not a saturation strike. Not a wave of a dozen decoys punching through alongside it. A single airframe, because the entire plan depended on staying inside a blind seam narrow enough that a second drone flying the same path 30 seconds later might not make it through at all. That's a strange kind of confidence to have in a plan. Bet everything on one machine, one flight path, one window of exposure, measured in seconds. If the estimate was off by even a little, the drone would fly directly into the strongest part of the jammer's beam and drop into the Black Sea, like the 3 that came before it. The Lyutyi selected for the mission carried serial designation L114 internally, a 50-kilogram warhead, and a flight plan that started at a launch position near Kalanchak, in Kherson Oblast, close enough to the Crimean administrative border that the drone would spend most of its flight over contested or occupied ground before ever reaching Hvardiiske. Total distance to target, 240 kilometers. At the Lyutyi's cruising speed, that put flight time at just under 3 hours. Most of it spent well below radar optimal altitude, hugging terrain the entire way. The flight plan itself was built from 11 discrete waypoints, each one chosen not for the shortest geometric path, but for the lowest predicted radar cross-section, given the surrounding terrain, threading between 2 low ridgelines north of the launch site before dropping to skim the Sivash lagoon's edge for the final 60 kilometers, where open water on one side and flat marsh on the other left almost nothing for a ground-based radar operator to distinguish the drone against. 3 hours is a long time to fly toward a target defended by an S-400 battery, a Buck M3 system, and a Pantsir S-1 close-in defense unit, all networked into the same air defense picture the Krasukha 4 was meant to protect. 3 hours where any single mistake in altitude, heading, or timing ends the mission before it starts. By late May 2026, the mapping phase was done. The window was chosen. What remained was waiting for a night when weather, moonlight, and Russian rotation schedules all lined up at once. They didn't line up in May. A storm system rolled across the northern Black Sea in the last week of the month, grounding the mission twice. Low cloud cover isn't just an inconvenience for a drone flying visual or thermal reference points at low altitude. It changes radar propagation, and it can change exactly where a jamming beam's effective edge sits on a given night. 2 planned launch windows were scrubbed because the atmospheric conditions Falcon's team had modeled the corridor against no longer matched what was actually happening over Hvardiiske. Then, in the first week of June, a different problem appeared. Signals intelligence picked up indications that the Krasukha 4 crew at Hvardiiske was due to rotate out, replaced by a fresh unit transferring in from a facility near Jonkoi. New crew meant new operating habits. Meant the carefully mapped blind seam might shift the moment different operators started making different decisions about where to point the antenna. Falcon's team had one option: move before the rotation, or restart the mapping process from scratch against an entirely new crew's behavior. Restarting meant months. Moving meant compressing the remaining preparation into roughly a week and accepting more uncertainty than anyone wanted. They moved. The strangest part of this whole operation isn't the corridor itself. It's that the final go decision came down to a single intercepted radio transmission, roughly 18 hours before launch, indicating the Hvardiiske crew had received orders to prioritize scanning toward the isthmus that specific night, in response to unrelated Ukrainian drone activity further north near Chonhar. That transmission was the confirmation Falcon's team needed. If the antenna's attention was locked north, the north-northwest lagoon corridor would be as open as the models predicted. Launch was set for the night of June 14th into June 15th, 2026. At 22:14 local time, the Lyutyi lifted off from the field near Kalanchak. No fanfare, no visible ignition flash beyond what a launch crew standing 30 meters away could see. A pusher propeller engine, quiet by military aviation standards, carried it up to cruise altitude within the first 90 seconds. For the next 2.5 hours, the drone flew almost entirely without correction from its ground crew. That's by design. A long-range strike like this isn't flown minute to minute by a joystick operator. It's flown by a preloaded flight plan, checked periodically, adjusted only if something goes wrong. Something almost went wrong at 23:08. A relay node Falcon's team used to maintain intermittent contact with the drone over occupied territory dropped its connection for nearly 4 minutes. In a mission where the entire premise rests on split-second timing against a moving jamming beam, 4 minutes of blind flight is not a small thing. Nobody in the Argus cell knew, in that window, whether the drone was still on its planned track or drifting into airspace the corridor mapping hadn't accounted for. Inside the control room, according to a second-hand account later relayed by someone present that night, the 4 minutes passed in near-total silence. Nobody spoke. One operator kept refreshing the same blank telemetry field every few seconds, as if refreshing it faster would make the signal return sooner. Falcon reportedly gave a single instruction during the gap: hold the mission clock, don't touch the flight plan, wait it out. There was nothing else to do. A relay failure at that stage of flight isn't something a ground crew can fix remotely, only something they can wait through. And waiting through 4 minutes of silence after 9 months of preparation is its own particular kind of stress that doesn't show up in any after-action report. The connection came back at 23:12. The Lyutyi was still on course, with an acceptable tolerance. Whatever caused the relay drop, later attributed to a temporary satellite handoff issue rather than Russian jamming, resolved itself before it cost the mission anything. 4 minutes. That's how close this entire operation came to failing over a communications glitch that had nothing to do with Krasukha 4 at all. By midnight, the drone had crossed into the outer edge of Hvardiiske's detection envelope. This is where the plan either worked or it didn't. This is where 9 months of bait drone losses, blind seam mapping, and one intercepted radio transmission either paid off or turned into a fourth wreck at the bottom of the Black Sea. At 0036, the Lyutyi dropped to its lowest planned altitude, skimming the terrain along the Sivash lagoon shoreline, exactly inside the corridor the models predicted would be thinnest. It held. No loss of GPS lock, no terminal guidance drift. The jammer's main beam, according to the reconstructed telemetry, stayed locked toward the isthmus the entire time, exactly as the intercepted transmission had promised. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Krasukha 4 exists to make exactly this kind of flight impossible. Every design decision in that system, every dollar of that $108 million, was spent making sure a GPS-guided drone couldn't hold a precision course anywhere near Hvardiiske. And it worked, right up until the moment the system had to choose where to point its attention. The moment it made that choice, it stopped protecting itself. That's not a flaw specific to this one Krasukha unit. That's a structural problem with any single point of coverage asked to defend against every direction at once. You can jam everywhere weakly, or you can jam one direction strongly. You cannot do both at full strength simultaneously, not with one antenna. What strikes me about this case is that nobody on the Russian side seems to have modeled that trade-off as a vulnerability. They modeled it as coverage. 300 kilometers, digitally sealed, the briefing said. Nobody in that briefing room seems to have asked what happens to the far edge of that arc the moment the antenna turns to look at something closer. The Lyutyi held its course for another 35 minutes, closing the final distance to Hvardiiske's perimeter. At 0104, its onboard optical system picked up the target it had been guided toward the entire flight. The Krasukha 4's rotating antenna mast, distinctly visible against the lower contrast of the surrounding vehicle park, illuminated just enough by the base's own perimeter lighting to lock a terminal aim point. Would you have trusted a plan this thin, riding on one intercepted radio call and a model built from 3 lost reconnaissance drones? Put yourself in Falcon's position for a second. 9 months of work, 1 shot, and the only feedback you get is whether the telemetry keeps updating or goes silent. At 0111 local time on June 15, 2026, it stopped updating in the way that mattered. The Lyutyi's warhead detonated against the base of the antenna mast and punched through into the adjacent command cabin, the vehicle housing the jamming complex's operators and its signal processing electronics. 11 seconds. That's roughly how long the terminal approach lasted from optical lock to detonation, based on the drone's last transmitted telemetry burst. 11 seconds to end 9 months of work on one side and 9 months of protection on the other. Among the crew on duty that night was a 23-year-old conscript technician, referred to in later communications only by the diminutive Vitya, assigned to the command cabin's signal processing station. Fragments of a medical evacuation request, intercepted the following morning, describe him as suffering shrapnel wounds to the shoulder and significant burns, stable enough to be moved, but requiring transfer to a hospital in Simferopol rather than the base's own aid station. He was, by several accounts, pieced together from the same traffic, one of only 3 men inside the cabin who survived the blast without requiring long-term hospitalization. Nothing in the available fragments identifies the other 2 crew members inside that cabin by name or fate, an absence that says something on its own. The paperwork trail for a friendly fire transformer fire does not usually need to stay this quiet. The immediate aftermath, on the ground, was chaos measured in a very specific, very Russian way. Silence, followed by contradiction. For the first several hours, there was no public acknowledgement at all. Regional telegram channels, the informal but often accurate early warning system for incidents across occupied Crimea, went quiet on the topic entirely. That silence, in itself, is data. Genuine accidents on Russian military installations in Crimea typically generate some chatter within an hour or two, even heavily filtered. A total blackout usually means someone higher up the chain has already ordered the narrative locked down before it starts. Base security procedures in the immediate aftermath followed a pattern that's shown up at nearly every Crimean strike site since 2023. A rapid, informal perimeter lockdown, well before any official order would have had time to reach the base through normal channels. Local residents near Hvardiiske reported checkpoints appearing on the access road within the hour, staffed by soldiers who reportedly told drivers only that there had been an incident and to use an alternate route. That kind of improvised, bottom-up secrecy, arriving faster than any top-down directive plausibly could, suggests something closer to institutional muscle memory than a coordinated cover-up. Everyone involved already knew the shape the story needed to take before anyone told them what to say. The first public explanation came almost 18 hours later, on the morning of June 15th, from a Crimea-focused telegram channel with a documented history of relaying information sourced from local utility and emergency services contacts. Their explanation, A transformer fire at a facility near Hvardiiske, contained quickly, no casualties reported. A transformer fire. Anyone with access to a commercial satellite pass could tell that story was wrong within another day. Here's the take that'll probably draw some disagreement. The transformer fire story wasn't really a lie built to fool Ukraine. Ukraine already knew what had happened, down to the second. It was a story built to manage the crew's own chain of command, and the local population living near a base that had just taken a hit, its officers swore couldn't happen. Unpopular opinion, but I think the bigger failure here isn't that Hvardiiske got hit. It's that Russian commanders had spent 9 months telling everyone above and below them that this specific system made a hit like this impossible. When it happened anyway, the chain of command had no honest version of events ready to give, because nobody had planned for the honest version to ever be necessary. Before the story moves to the imagery that finally broke the official version, it's worth spending a moment on how that imagery actually got interpreted, because a satellite took a picture undersells the amount of cross-checking involved. The open-source analysts who picked this case up were not, for the most part, working from a single clean photograph. They were working from a stack of partial, sometimes low-resolution passes, purchased or scraped from multiple commercial providers, stitched together against historical baseline imagery of the same site going back to 2023. That baseline mattered enormously. Without it, a scorched vehicle silhouette and a bent antenna mast could plausibly be explained by almost anything. With it, analysts could show, frame by frame, exactly what had changed between one pass and the next, and exactly what hadn't. By June 16th, roughly 36 hours after impact, the story shifted again. Russia's Ministry of Defense, through its standard channel of unofficial statements to state media, characterized the Hvardiiske incident as a scheduled maintenance outage, language deliberately vague enough to avoid confirming any weapon had reached the base at all. Would this explanation have held up if nobody outside Russia had eyes on the site? Almost certainly, for a while. It didn't hold up because commercial satellite imagery doesn't wait for permission. A Planet Labs pass over Hvardiiske at 11:42 local time on June 16th captured the aftermath in enough detail to end the debate. The rotating antenna's supporting mast was snapped roughly a third of the way up its structure, the dish itself lying at an angle against the ground beside the vehicle it had been mounted on. The adjacent command cabin, the vehicle housing crew and processing electronics, showed clear scorching and structural collapse along its upper section, consistent with an internal detonation and fire rather than any external transformer fault. A second, higher-resolution pass, obtained 2 days later, on June 18th, from a different commercial provider, added detail that the first image couldn't resolve. Thermal residue patterns around the collapsed cabin roofline were consistent with an internal fuel or electronics fire burning for an extended period after the initial blast, not the brief flash and extinguish signature typical of an electrical transformer fault. Debris scattering around the vehicle park showed a directional pattern radiating outward from the antenna mast's base, consistent with an impact and detonation at that specific point, rather than a fire that started inside the cabin and spread outward on its own. Independent analysts working the imagery, comparing notes across at least 3 separate open-source research groups, converged on the same reading within about a day of the second pass becoming available. This was munition damage, not a maintenance incident, and the pattern was consistent with a small guided warhead striking the mast directly. There is no transformer at Hvardiiske positioned anywhere near that vehicle park. Ukrainian open-source analysts confirmed that within hours of the imagery becoming public, cross-referencing older satellite passes that showed the facility's actual power infrastructure sitting nearly 400 meters away, undamaged. Inside her, formal confirmation of a successful strike follows its own internal protocol, one that rarely gets discussed publicly. A strike isn't logged as confirmed until at least 2 independent sources corroborate the outcome: commercial satellite imagery, signals intelligence showing a change in the target's electronic behavior, and, where available, a secondary human source with eyes on the ground. For Hvardiiske, the electronic confirmation came first, within hours, when analysts monitoring the region noted the Krasukha 4's characteristic jamming signature had simply vanished from the spectrum it had occupied for 9 months. The imagery came days later. The formal internal designation of the strike as confirmed, high confidence, wasn't logged until June 19th, 5 days after the drone had already done its work. Somewhere in the days after the imagery went public, The men who had been on duty that night stopped being an abstraction and became, at least internally, a problem to be managed. Fragments of intercepted communications from the days immediately following the strike describe what amounts to an informal internal inquiry, conducted not by any formal military investigative body, but by officers 1 or 2 ranks above the Hvardiiske battalion itself, trying to establish a version of events that could survive being repeated up the chain without anyone having to admit the antenna's blind seam existed at all. Surviving personnel from the overnight watch, including the operator referred to by the call sign Osnova, were reportedly questioned individually over the following week, less an interrogation in any formal sense than a series of increasingly pointed conversations about why the antenna had been oriented where it was at 0111 that morning. The answers, as far as the intercepted fragments suggest, were consistent and, in their own way, unsatisfying to everyone involved. Standard procedure, following the specific alert priority issued that night regarding activity near Chonhar, no indication of any threat from the lagoon approach because no such threat had ever previously materialized from that direction. Every answer was true. None of them were useful to a chain of command that needed someone to have made a mistake, because the uncomfortable alternative was admitting that no one had, and the system had failed anyway. That's a harder story to write up in a report, and a much harder one to explain to a superior officer who wants a name attached to a failure this expensive. So what actually happened in the 72 hours after that antenna hit the ground? This is where the story stops being about one drone and starts being about what a single point of failure costs an entire defensive network. Krasukha 4 wasn't just a jammer sitting in isolation. It fed data and suppression coverage into the broader Crimean air defense picture, working alongside the S-400 battery, the Buk M3 system, and Pantsir S-1 units positioned to protect Hvardiiske and the surrounding approaches. Those systems didn't stop functioning when the jammer went down, but their effectiveness against low-altitude, GPS-guided threats depends heavily on exactly the kind of electronic suppression Krasukha 4 provided. Ukrainian signals analysts monitoring the region in the days following the strike documented a measurable change in air defense reaction times across the western Crimean sector. Before June 15th, radar-to-intercept response against small, low-flying drone threats in that arc averaged somewhere around 40 seconds, according to patterns reconstructed from prior engagements. In the 72 hours following the Hvardiiske strike, that window stretched to nearly 3 minutes on multiple documented occasions, as Pantsir and Buk crews lost the layered electronic picture that normally cued their radars onto low-signature targets faster. 3 minutes doesn't sound dramatic until you understand what it means in this specific war. A drone flying at low altitude can cover a lot of ground in 3 minutes. It can change heading. It can complete a terminal approach against a second target entirely, one that would have been intercepted with 40 seconds of warning, but slips through with 3 minutes of confusion instead. Would this happen again in a year, given how fast both sides adapt? Comment yes or no, because I've gone back and forth on this one myself. Ukraine did not, as far as declassified fragments show, immediately exploit that 72-hour window with a wave of follow-on strikes elsewhere in the sector. That restraint is itself part of the story analysts have debated since. Some argue it was a missed opportunity, a rare window left unused. Others argue the entire operation was built around eliminating one specific, high-value node, not opening a broader offensive, and that spending the window chasing secondary targets would have risked losing the corridor's element of surprise before Russia had time to notice it existed at all. Russia noticed within days regardless. By June 20th, satellite imagery showed a replacement Krasukha unit transferred from the Jazankoy facility ahead of its originally planned rotation schedule, being positioned at Hvardiiske. The gap in coverage, real as it was for those 72 hours, closed faster than Ukrainian planners might have liked. The replacement crew arrived with a directive that intercepted communications describe, somewhat vaguely, as revised orientation protocols. Language that suggests someone above the battalion level had at least partially recognized the actual problem, even without ever saying so directly in any traceable transmission. Whether that revision meaningfully closes the lagoon corridor or simply shifts the blind seam to a different bearing entirely is not something the available evidence resolves. Analysts inside HUR reportedly consider the second outcome more likely than the first, on the theory that you cannot fix a structural limitation of directional jamming with a new set of standing orders. Only relocate where it happens to be thinnest on any given night. What happened to the people who were supposed to prevent this? That's the part official Russian statements never address directly, but reconstructed personnel movements suggest an answer. The Hvardiiske EW battalion's commanding officer at the time of the strike, identified in intercepted communications only by rank and partial call sign, consistent with the designation Major Kalinin, was reassigned within 2 weeks of the incident, according to Signals Intelligence Tracking Unit communications in the following month. No public disciplinary action was ever announced. In an army that rarely admits fault publicly, a quiet reassignment often functions as the closest thing to an official verdict. Osnova, the overnight operator whose habits Falcon's team had spent months quietly studying, does not appear by call sign in any communications traced after late June, an absence that could mean a transfer, a demotion, or simply a change in radio discipline following the incident. The fragments this story is built from don't resolve which. The math behind all of this is genuinely brutal and worth sitting with before moving on. One Lyutyi drone, built for an estimated cost somewhere around $200,000 depending on configuration. One Krasukha 4 complex, valued at $108 million. That's a cost-exchange ratio of roughly 540 to 1. No defense budget survives many nights like that. But the deeper cost isn't measured in dollars at all. It's measured in what Russian commanders now have to assume about every other Krasukha unit still operating across occupied territory. If Hvardiiske's blind seam existed because the system had to choose where to point its strongest suppression, every other unit has the same structural weakness, because it's not a flaw in one machine, it's a flaw in the physics of directional jamming itself. That's the sub-mystery this story opened with and never fully explained until now. Why did a system built specifically to blind Ukrainian drones end up drawing a map straight to itself? The answer is that no coverage envelope is uniform. Somewhere, every jammer has a direction it's paying less attention to. The only question is whether someone is patient enough and willing to lose enough cheap reconnaissance drones to find it. Is this a stronger case for the Krasukha 4 as a design failure, or for Falcon's team as simply better at exploiting an unavoidable limitation than anyone had previously tried to be? That's genuinely not a settled question among the analysts who've looked at this case, and it's one worth thinking about rather than accepting a tidy answer either way. What's clearer is the pattern this fits into. Hvardiiske wasn't an isolated incident. It followed a string of strikes across 2025 and 2026, targeting exactly this category of high-value, low-quantity Russian assets. Electronic warfare complexes, radar systems, command nodes that cost enormous amounts to build and cannot be quickly replaced in equal numbers. Russia has more tanks than it knows what to do with. It does not have an unlimited supply of $108 million jamming systems, or the trained crews to operate them. Every one of those losses forces a choice. Spread remaining systems thinner across more territory, accepting weaker coverage everywhere, or consolidate them at fewer high-value sites, accepting that each remaining site becomes a more attractive, more heavily studied target the moment its location is confirmed. There's no clean way out of that trade-off. That's the real legacy of the Hvardiiske strike, more than the single antenna that hit the ground on June 15th. It confirmed, in front of every Russian EW crew commander watching the aftermath from a distance, that the system meant to make them invisible has a direction it isn't watching. Finding that direction again, at a different base, with a different crew, is now simply a matter of time and patience. We cut one detail from this reconstruction for length: the specific bearing measurements Falcon's team used to map the corridor down to individual compass degrees. If there's enough interest, that's a technical breakdown worth its own video. Comment more if you want that one. One machine held together the electronic shield over western Crimea for 9 months. It took one drone, one intercepted radio call, and 11 seconds of terminal flight to prove that shield had a hole built into its own design from the start. The antenna that was supposed to make Ukrainian strikes impossible ended up being the reason one of them succeeded. If this kind of reconstruction, built from satellite passes, intercepted communications, and declassified planning fragments, is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. This channel exists to document exactly this: the parts of this war that never make it into a headline, but explain everything a headline leaves out. Drop a comment with what you think the next target on that list looks like. We read every one.